I wonder how the prescriptivist kind of accounts for the fact that languages change over time. I mean, the way English is spoken now is very different from the way Shakespeare spoke English. The way Spanish is spoken now is very different from the way Cervantes spoke Spanish. So these languages, they change over time. Um, are these changes due to people breaking the rules of language?
I think that's the narrative, yes. To the extent that prescriptivists, well, I suppose, in a sense, this the notion that languages changes is central to prescriptivism, in that it's sort of like a form of nostalgia, or for I think a lot of prescriptivists, there's this sort of element of nostalgia that, you know, at some point, there is this sort of perfect form of the language, and it's all things are all falling apart nowadays with,
Like, for example, is that true?
or since a certain point,
Mm.
with young people in
Yeah,
particular,
yeah, yeah. The way young
speaking
people,
very loosely.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The way young people
Um,
speak nowadays is horrible.
and so that in that sense, they have identified like the mechanism of language change, that it is driven by younger speakers,
of course.
right? Um, but or people learning the language,
Mm.
um, or not learning, acquiring the language. Um, but yeah, but sort of, so that for that to sort of hold up, the prescriptivist has to sort of set some point that's like far enough back that it seems like some sort of golden age, but not too far that the language is like,
Mm.
that the fact that languages change so much over time
Mm.
is obvious. So
Mm.
for English, for example, I guess you couldn't really go back much further than the sort of early mid 19th century for this sort of
Mm.
golden age,
Mm.
because
But
further back and it would become too obvious that
mm.
actually,
Mm.
this is a sort of ongoing process. And if you go back to, if you really wanted to go go the whole hog, then you'd be going back, a couple of thousand years, and
Mhm.
what you got to would be nothing like
Nothing.
English,
That's
completely incomprehensible. It would
Yep,
be like some
absolutely
form of German.
correct.
Um,
Correct. You would have more chance of, you know, reading an Arabic text and understanding it without having studied the language as you would, something from that time period. Um, so, if a language changes over time, and that's done by people breaking the rules. One thing
mhm.
we should mention later on is that the way we use rules in the prescriptive sense and the descriptive sense are two different things. But we'll talk about that in a moment. Why does a language live in this state of flux? Why will there never be, this is the final, the best, the most complete version of English or French or Italian or whatever?
Well, I mean, that's possible, but at that point, the last speaker of English is dying.
Yes, and the
There
language.
are languages
Mm-hmm.
that have reached that final state,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
right? The languages that we're lucky enough to, in the recent decades, to have, preserved,
Mm.
when, although all the native speakers are dead.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's the point, right? So as long as people, or at least people in any number, speaking the language and passing it on to the next generation,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to change, partly because although there are these sort of broad functions of language
Mm.
that we would probably think of as sort of timeless and
Mm-hmm.
spaceless, that sort
Mm.
of all languages in all places at all times have been
Mm.
used to do this kind of thing. There are more specific uses, particularly with regard to like sort of certain, events or trends, or sort of changes in how we live our lives that will influence how language is used, but that's sort of mainly in terms of new words, from a sort of perspective of historical linguistics, though there's this sort of other element, right, that people aren't necessarily aware of, which is also going on, whereby because children don't learn language from a textbook. They have to, and their parents haven't learned it from a textbook either. They're probably not theoretical linguistics linguists. What the child has to do is like interpret all this mess of sound that's hitting them from the day that they're born, and construct some sort of system out of that, as in like, so this is, you make this sort of set of noises to mean this thing, the other set of noises to mean another thing. And yeah, and as this is all in the head, there's no guarantee that the child is going to sort of construct exactly the same system in their head that their parents had. So
this is multiplied by generation, and over time the language, if you wait long enough, looks very different at different periods in history, right?
Yeah, I mean, to the point that, we say Old English, Middle English, so forth. These are effectively different languages. Like,
I would agree.
So there's a sort of continuous, historical record for a language like English, which takes us back, over 1,000 years. But if we, went back to, speak to Chaucer, we'd find it quite difficult to get on.
Absolutely, yes. And yeah, it would be difficult for us to understand, and it would be very, very difficult for us to make ourselves understood as well, right?